Hello and welcome to another Avid tutorial. This one is on settings and customization. So we're going to walk through where the settings are, kind of an overview of what they cover, and then specifically go through some settings that you may want to check and customize both for your setup and for your own particular user profile. We are not going to hit every setting. As you'll see, there are a ton of settings available in Avid that you can play with and change, but I do want to highlight some ones that for the beginning editor or if someone getting started in Avid are things you particularly want to be aware of or check as you're setting up your interface. So as always, to get to the settings menu in Avid, I'm just going to hit Command comma, and here's my settings tab. And first thing I'll note is at the top here we have 4 tabs: Format, Project, User, and Site. And these are different groups of settings that have to do with where the settings are stored. So site settings are things that are specific to this particular hardware configuration. So anytime I open up a project on this computer, regardless of who's using it, what user profile we're in, what project we're in, what the format of the project is, these are settings that are specific to this computer. So you can notice they mostly have to do with things that might be connected to the computer that you're telling Avid about, or hardware settings, or things telling it how to work with the particular configuration you have. We're not going to mess with any of those, but that's what site settings are. Project settings are things that, as you'd imagine, are specific to the project. So this is something that no matter what user is working on the project or what computer it's on, once you open this project, these settings are going to come through with it. And generally, there's not going to be a lot you'd want to mess with in here. Just to kind of give you an example of something, in the media creation settings, you can set, okay, for this project, if I go to import some new media, what's the default codec that it's going to bring it in, and what format is it kind of wrapping it in? So video wrapper format, audio wrapper format. You can see I have some options for things like this. So those are all things that you're kind of just setting defaults for this project. Within the audio, you can set what the bit depth and sample rate is. So things that are tied to the specific type of project you're doing. The format tab is stuff specific to this project, but it's things that you can change kind of the display or how it's treating the project. And the main thing I want to note in here is you'll see I can actually change within this project between different ways I might want to look at it. So right now it's set up as an HD 1080 project, but if I wanted to look at this in Ultra HD or in 4K, I could do that, but you'll notice that while I can change the sort of resolution of how it's being processed, I can't change the frame rate. This is locked. So this is one thing within Avid. You can bring in media at different frame rates and it will process it to work within the project that you're in, but a project is tied to a specific frame rate. So that's something that when you set up your project, you want to make sure you get the right frame rate in the first place, because that is one of the things you can't change later. And as with everything, there are always ways around this. And if you screwed up the frame rate and you've already done a lot of work in your project, you don't have to scrap all that and start over. There are ways to get around it, but generally speaking, you want to make sure you get the frame rate right. But then, in this case, this is actually a UHD project. The media is UHD, and I'm just choosing to look at it in a 1080 version to make it a little easier on my computer, and I down converted all the media to 1080, but if I wanted to go back and look at it in UHD, we can do that, and it's going to scale it appropriately. So that's what that tab is. The one I want to spend most of our time on here is the user settings. And you'll notice at the top here, this should look familiar from when we set up our Avid user. I have my user profile that I can pick which one I want to be in. And so everything in this menu, which you'll notice is a lot. There are a lot of settings that are tied to the user. And these all have to do with the interface and kind of how you're interacting with Avid and how it's set up to be customized the way that you like to work. And so all these things are stored with the user. So no matter what project I'm in or what computer I'm on, if I load up these user settings, all this stuff is going to come with it. That's really handy. So let's walk through a few of these. And what I'd like to do is kind of start with some of the ones that you're going to want to kind of set up once and probably just leave alone. And then hit on some of the things that you might sort of customize and keep working with as you get more familiar with Avid and kind of develop your preferences and figure out how you like to work and how you might like to change things. So first off, right at the top here is audio. And these are some sort of audio settings of, again, this is not tied to the project. This is for the user, how I want audio to be handled. And the one I would suggest checking here is default pan for mono tracks. So what this is saying is if I bring in a clip and it has multiple tracks of audio, so for example, let's say you shot something in production 1 on the NX3 or any camera that just records sort of 2 channels of audio all the time, do I bring in each of those centered, or do I put track 1 on the left and track 2 on the right? Most of the time, most of the audio we're working with, you're gonna want to bring in centered, because you may have only recorded something on channel 1 and you don't want all your audio panned to the left. Or you might have had 2 microphones, but it's not a stereo microphone. It's, maybe a lavalier mic and a boom mic. And again, you don't want to necessarily say, okay, I always want boom audio on the left and lav audio on the right. So my recommendation would be centered, but again, you can follow your own preferences there. That's one I always like to set and forget about it. Number 2 is bin views. And what these are is there's kind of several ways that you can kind of look at a bin. And remember, this is a bin over here, and it has a particular view. And you can see my bin views are here. So there's different ways it can look. And what's changing is what things are sort of displayed here. So you can see in this one, it has this color tab here, which there's nothing in right now. It has a long space for name. And this is really handy, right? There's just several different ways that you can choose to look at this and kind of set those up however you want, and customize these. If I go back into my settings, you can see these bin views are listed here. And if I open this up, what it's going to show me is all the possible things that could show up in a bin. And as you can see, there are tons of them. And most of the time, I am not going to want to sort of scan through all these. I could make them all available and then they'll all be in the bin. I would just have to scroll over a really long ways here to get through all of them. See this one, I've just narrowed it down to just a few because I said, okay, these are the things that are important to me that I want to kind of see all the time. And I don't want to have a whole bunch of other stuff here scrolled off. Here's one that's a little longer. You can set up multiple different bin views like this. And in here is where you would customize those. So I could say, my basic bin view, these are the things I want to be able to see. Format frames per second. And you can choose whatever is useful to you. And honestly, sometimes depending on what projects I'm working on, sometimes I'll go in and say, man, I really should have selected this. And I'll go and update my user settings with that as I sort of change work preferences and what things I'm finding useful. But that's what this is. So I can highlight whatever columns I want to show up, unhighlight whatever ones I don't. And I have 7, let's say, sets of settings here. So I can set up 7 different types of bins with different views. And then what I can do back here in the bin setting is default bin views. So I can say, okay, out of those ones I set up, when I open a new bin, what do I want to see show up? How do I want it to look from the get-go? And in this case, I've set my default view to film, which again doesn't mean it's necessarily anything specific to film. It's just that's the name of this. So this is my default bin view. Anything I open up a new bin, it's going to open up looking like this. This is something that seems a little abstract, but you'll quickly find can be really useful to customize those to quickly give you access to the information you need and not having you look at a whole bunch of stuff that you don't use in your particular setup. And again, the reason these are in user settings is because this is very customizable. So for instance, I know some editors who like to color code clips, and so the color tab is important for them, and that's how they sort of work through organization. That's not something I use a ton, so it's something that I've turned off in most of my bin views. That's not right or wrong. That just has to do with us having different preferences of how we do these. Okay, so keeping scrolling down, the composer settings. And composer, you remember, is this window back here where we can see the source and record. And I'm actually going to just make that a little bigger so we can see it better now that I'm kind of done looking at the bins. So here's my composer window over here. Move this. You can see, by the way, there's several different tabs here that go through different things. First off, in terms of window, I have some options for how much information I want displayed up here and how much I want down here. So if I wanted 2 rows of buttons on the bottom here and just 1 row of data at the top, I could do that. And you'll notice now there's just 1 row of data here, but now I have more buttons here at the bottom. If I want 2 rows of data and 2 rows of buttons, I could do that. The trade-off here is, as with most things, you have a limited amount of screen real estate. So it's figuring out what's useful to you, what do you most like to see and have right at your fingertips, and where is it more valuable to have more space. So for instance, this bottom row of buttons isn't things that I use a lot, so I like to just go with the single row down there, but I like a lot of information at the top because a lot of times I like to look at the various timecode options and be able to set those to show me things that are going on, so I'll leave that way. In the edit tab here, you have some settings that just have to do with, for lack of a better word, how things edit within the composer window. I would not necessarily mess with many of these as you're getting started until you kind of get a sense of what you're doing and figure out what of these might be useful to you. The one you may want to check is the auto create new tracks. You can see there's a little help box that comes up if you hover over something. This is if I drag a clip into the timeline and it has some video or audio that is not set to go to existing tracks, will it auto create those tracks, or will that stuff just not get put into the sequence? Here's a move. This one is pretty handy. You can see the different options here. Stop at head frames, so meaning beginning of clip, stop at tail frames, stop at markers, and ignore track selectors. And this is very personal preference, but what they're talking about here is if I'm using my A and S buttons, so A takes me to previous cut, S takes me to next cut, it's saying, how am I doing that? Do I stop at every time there's a tail frame, so the last frame of a shot like this, or do I just go to the head frames, which is what my settings are done? The ignore track selectors one is saying, do I go every time there's a cut? So for instance, let's say here, there's cuts in the audio track, but not on the video track. Do I stop there because there's a cut, even though it's not on all the tracks, or do I only go to places where there's a cut on all the active tracks? So if I go back into those settings and change that, so I'm going to uncheck ignore track selectors. So now it's going to care what tracks are selected. And now if I do jump cut to cut, you'll see that it skips over this one in the middle because I have all these tracks selected, so it's only going to jump to places where there's a cut on all those tracks. And if I turn off the video 1 track, I press the 8 button to do that. Oops. And the timecode track, now it's going to stop at all of those because I only have the audio tracks selected, and you can see there are cuts on all the audio tracks there. So this is one, again, my personal preference is I like this setup because I just want to go to every cut and not worry about only stopping at places where every single track that's active has a cut right at the same spot, but you know, your mileage may vary. And multicam view, if you're doing multicam editing, which is beyond kind of a basics tutorial, so we're going to skip on that. And some other stuff about just the viewer and how it handles some things there. By the way, on the viewer, let me pop back to format here for a second. Something I didn't mention at the bottom is this mask margins tab. And this is if you had a project that, let's say, was shot 16:9, but you actually want to mat it to like 239. I can apply that. And you'll see what it did over here is I still see my original 16:9 frame, and it's masked it in the viewer to show what my sort of final framing would look like. I can sort of customize exactly how much that's cropping. These are just the defaults, but you can set your own. And that way I can get a sense of what my final composition is going to look like if I want to do that. In this case, this is actually 16:9 footage, so I'm going to leave it as such. Okay, back into here. Going past the composer, there are export settings, and I'm going to get into the detail of these in a different tutorial about importing and exporting. What I'd like you to note is I can create in Avid essentially infinite numbers of different export settings. So you can see there's a bunch that I've created here. When you start out, you will not have as many. You'll have sort of the default ones that have been set, and then if you start to create your own and save those, you can expand that list. Each of these are saved with your user. So again, a nice thing about this is I can spend some time really tweaking and creating very specific, precise export settings that do something exactly the way I want. And then anytime I'm in any project or I go to any other computer and I pop in those user settings, I immediately have all my export options that I've already checked through and I know are correct. Now, if you're working in a lab situation, this is a little different because you can't necessarily trust that the last person on the computer didn't accidentally load up your user settings, wasn't paying attention and changed some export settings. So you still kind of got to go and check. But if you're on your own computer, This is really handy because you can make as many different export settings as you want. And then I could look at this one and say, okay, I need to export a DNX HD 36 for Pro Tools, and we'll talk about what that means when we go into codecs, but I know that I've already set these settings and check it. I just select that, hit export, and I'm done. I don't have to worry about going through all these submenus. And I can keep as many of these as I would like, and they're all stored with my user. Okay, let's look at the interface option. This is where really you're just tweaking looks largely, so kind of how things look. So for instance, if I want to go with the brighter interface instead of the darker one, I could apply that, and I can change if I want my highlights to be a different color. You can see how these sort of now change to purple. And if I want things to brighten up some of the icons, or I should say the sort of contrast of them. So if you look down here at kind of how these look at one end of the scale versus the other end of the scale where they're sort of more muted. I'll be honest, this is something that they changed about 2018 or 19, how this was handled within the settings. And this is one of the rare places where I feel like the software's actually gone backwards. There used to be a lot more flexibility in terms of you could kind of set any set of colors that you wanted for every different thing within Avid. And it was probably overkill, but it was really nice to be able to sort of customize your view exactly the way you wanted, particularly for a lab setting, where you could set some weird color like, hey, I want the background of my bins to be neon green or something. And then if you came in, when you loaded up, if you noticed that your backgrounds weren't neon green, it was a great immediate visual cue that you weren't loaded as your own user, you were loaded as somebody else. They've simplified that down a lot, but took away a little bit of that freedom. Oh well, anyway, it is what it is, but that's where you can go in and tweak the way that some of these things look and get a particular kind of view of how you want things to go. Okay, that was the interface. We're going to come back to keyboard in a second. I'm going to skip down here to the timeline. Remember, the timeline is the window down here where you kind of see your sequence as it gets built. And you have some settings here that, again, depending on the way you particularly want to work, you might want to tweak. Here's the display. Again, I have some things for how things will look. This one, if it gets set differently, might screw you up a little bit. So just pointing it out that this is when you start playing, if the cursor was going to, scroll past the end of the screen, if I had a sequence that was longer than can fit, does it scroll across the screen, and then when it gets to the right end, it sort of goes back to the left and sort of moves over to the next whole page of my playback? Or does it scroll kind of keeping the cursor in the middle and letting the footage kind of scroll by it? Or do we see no movement when it's playing? Some text color stuff, how things look, and a couple things here you can see just where do things show up and how do they look for you. The edit one has some more options in terms of kind of when you're moving things around in the timeline. And what I mean by that is not if you're using your keyboard shortcuts, but most of those are particularly if I'm, grabbing clips here and trying to actually move them and do things like that. How does that behave? So that's something where I would encourage you, if that's something you do a lot, is edit that way, then timeline settings in the edit tab is something you might want to play with, changing some of these and see what works for you. Some of these have to do with whether things are going to stay in sync when you're moving them. If you have the sync locks on, is it going to try to keep other things in sync? The new sequence one is a good one to check. So if you say, I'm always working with stuff that has multiple audio tracks starting out, maybe I want all my new sequences to start with 4 audio tracks instead of 2. And I know I'm someone who likes to overlay a lot of titles, so maybe I'm going to make my default 3 video tracks to start instead of 1. So you can change that, and then when I create a new sequence, it will follow those settings. Okay, last thing before I cycle back up to the top to look at the keyboard settings is the trim. And you'll remember in Avid when I'm talking about trim, what we're talking about is this mode. We're kind of looking at the last frame of one shot and the start of the next shot and kind of how that plays. So first thing is loop, play loop. So what they're talking about there is if I go into my trim mode and I hit play, spacebar, or I could hit this little play loop thing, what it's going to do is play a little bit before that cut through a little bit after that cut. And it's just going to loop through there so I can kind of see what the cut itself looks like. And here's where I can set how long does it play before it, how long does it play after that, and is there a gap between the loops or does it just keep looping? So if I want sort of a second to process what just happened, I could set a little intermission here. That's pretty handy. And this is something that I found is very subjective. Like some people want to see a big chunk around the cut. Some people want to just see the cut itself. And then in here I have some settings for how it actually does the trimming. You can see there's a setting down here in terms of how it handles things. If I have the sync lock turned on, which remember is this, which is Avid sort of saying, I'm going to try to keep this in sync, but no promises. The one I want to point out, because this is one that people are very divided on whether they like to use or not, is what's called JKL trim. And you remember JKL keyboard shortcuts in pretty much every editor are sort of my standard play backward, pause, and play forward, respectively. So J, play backward, K, pause, L, play forward. And I do that when I'm sort of playing or scanning through footage. If I have this turned on, what it allows me to do is use those when I'm in trim mode, and it's actually going to do the trimming live as I'm doing it. So if I press J, it's going to start playing backwards, and it's also moving that trim backwards. So if you look at the cut here as I'm moving it, now I'll do L and play it forward, it's actually trimming the cut as I play. Some people find that really obnoxious and scary. Like, I'm just trying to look at the cut, and every time I hit play by accident, it's actually changing the trim. Other people like it because it's a very fast way to trim, right? So if I know I want to move the cut backwards, instead of trying to guess how many frames, I just sort of play it backwards till I find what I want, and then I could switch over and say, I just want to shorten the right side up a little bit, so I'll switch over to the right side with the right bracket key and play forward a little bit. And great. And hit K to pause, and I've already done my trimming, so I don't have to worry about doing the, whether on the keyboard or on the screen, sort of like I want to move back or forward this many frames. It's just sort of live happening. So again, that's something that some of you will like, some of you won't, but that's where you can set whether you want that enabled or not. I personally like to be able to do it, so I have mine checked, but it's also something, honestly, when I started out, I didn't particularly like because I often would hit the wrong key. It's something that took me getting a little more practice before I got comfortable with doing. Okay, so as you can see, there's a ton of other user settings here that we skipped over, and I encourage you, particularly if you plan on being an editor, at some point you'll want to get into all of these and kind of see what they mean. But there's one big one that I want to get back to because it's one of the main things you will probably want to customize to yourself as you start working, and this is the keyboard. So if I double click on my keyboard here, I can see a keyboard, and I can see the shortcuts for what all of these are doing. And I'll note you actually have kind of 2 layers of keyboard, which is a little limited compared to some other editors, which will have 4 or 5 layers. And by layers, I mean, here I have my regular keys. So if I hit a button, what they do. So when I hit J, it plays backwards. Like, that's what that keyboard shortcut's going to do. If I hold down the Shift key, I can see this second layer, and this is saying, if you hold Shift and push one of these buttons, what does it do? So example here, if I hold Shift and press T, that opens up the titler for me. That's what I have my shortcut set to do. Some software does have, like I said, more layers. So there might be a layer for like, okay, if you're holding Command, what does it do? If you're holding Option, what does it do? Pro Tools, I think, has like, if you press the button, or press the button with Shift, or press the button with Option, or press the button with Shift and Option, or with Shift and Option and Command, or Control and Command, or Control and Option and Command. There's like just pages and pages of those shortcuts. Avid has 2, so that's what you get, 2 layers of keyboard shortcuts. What this looks like here should look very similar to yours. I don't remember offhand if I have anything that's slightly different that I've customized different than the SMU keyboard one, but most of it's going to look pretty similar. So this is our SMU film layout. When I'm mentioning keyboard shortcuts, those are the ones I'm going to mention. But as you start editing, you might find that there's some things that you like to do a lot, and you're like, man, it'd be really great if there was a keyboard shortcut for this. So one that I'll use as an example that I programmed, and I don't remember if I added it into the SMU film user or not, is I like to be able to turn the waveforms off and on with the Y key. And what I mean by that is, if I'm down here working, like, I just want to see what the audio looks like here. I press the Y button and the waveforms pop up so I can kind of see what the audio looks like. And then I'm done looking at that, and so I'm going to turn it back off. These are often useful to see, which is why I like a button that enables me to quickly pull those up. The downside is, particularly if you have a lot of audio tracks or really long media, like if I was looking at a whole feature film, it actually takes Avid a while to kind of process all these and kind of draw them out. So it's not something I like to leave on all my tracks all the time in every time I'm viewing. It's something when I get to a moment where like, okay, I need to see the audio here because I'm looking for where was that peak. Okay, there it is. So I like to be able to toggle those on and off. So I put that in as a keyboard shortcut. You might find your own things that the way that you particularly edit, things that you like to be able to do, or maybe you're familiar with another editing program and got used to, oh, I press this button to do this, and I'd really like to just keep that the same in Avid because that's what I'm used to. You can do that. So the way that we do this is I'm going to open up this keyboard in the settings, and then I'm going to open up my command palette, which is listed under tools, or it's command 3. Where is it? Way down here. There we go. Okay, and this is a list of a lot of the commands you can do in Avid. It's not all of them, but it's a lot of them. So if I set this to button reassignment, what I'm going to do is just say, this is saying, okay, take one of these and make it a button and replace one of these existing buttons. So if I say, you know, I want my go to in point to be the W key. I'm just going to have two of those right next to each other for some reason. I can do that, and I just dragged it down here, and then I'll just reset this to what I want it to be, which is W go to out point. So I can drag these things like that. This active palette button I don't use, but so that you know what it is, that makes all these buttons active. So if I have this command palette up and I hit this, and I say go to in point, I don't know if you notice down here, it does that. If I hit go to out point, it does that on the timeline, except I don't have an out point on my timeline. If I say, you know, move forward, you can notice in the timeline down here, it's moving forward. So that literally makes this sort of active buttons. Most of the time I don't have this open, so I don't use that function very often, but that's what it is. And then the last thing, and this is where this is really powerful, is menu to button reassignment. So anything that's not here already, and you can see there are a lot of commands here that I can just easily drag onto my keyboard for whatever thing I'm trying to do. But let's say there's something I want that's not in any of those. I can hit menu to button reassignment, and this is going to allow me to take anything that's in a menu in Avid, and that includes all the top menus up here. It also includes all the sort of window menus down here. And you can see a lot of these windows have their own little menus. Any of those things can be assigned to the keyboard. So here's how the menu to button reassignment works. Let's say I want to do something with some of my audio, like this is actually where I found the waveform one. Let's say I want to show volumes, and I want to have a little toggle button always available for that out of this hamburger menu. What I'm going to do is I do it a little bit backwards. So it says menu to button reassignment. I'm going to select the button first and then the menu. So I'm going to go in here and I'm going to make this Shift V for volume. So I'm going to click on that and it gets highlighted here. And then I'm going to go down here and just select in the menu the thing I want to do. And you notice it didn't actually do it because I was in this menu selection button, so it didn't actually do volume there. But now if I hold down my Shift key, you can see that it has mapped that key. This is now a volume toggle. So anything that's in a menu, I can assign to a keyboard shortcut. That is really handy. I love doing this. So one that I have set up on mine is sometimes I like to be able to jump into full screen when I'm watching something, and then jump right back into my edit workflow. And I've set those up as Shift left bracket and Shift right bracket. So if I close out all these things, and I'm working on my edit, and I say, I want to see what this looks like. Shift right bracket, I'm in full frame. Shift left bracket, I'm right back into my edit view. And I got to those via, these are different workspaces. So there was my edit view 1. The view in full frame is somewhere over here on the timeline. I don't actually even remember where some of these are in the menus because I just use the keyboard shortcuts all the time. But as you can see, this is really powerful because I can map sort of any function you can imagine in Avid to a keyboard button and have ready access to it. And this is how I'm going to work really efficiently, is get the shortcuts that I use mapped, and I'm going to learn where those are, and then I don't have to be searching around in menus or submenus or going down to the little hamburger menu here. Anything that I use regularly in the way that I work, I can just jump in here. So we've given you what I think is a pretty useful set of basic shortcuts and things that are the editing functions most of you are going to use most of the time, and that's our SMU Film default Avid user setup. But as you get practiced with this, I encourage you to start changing some things. If there's something that you find the way that you work, you use a certain function a lot, great. Map it in here, give yourself a keyboard shortcut for it, and you've got it ready to go, and that'll help you work faster for whatever your own style of editing is. Okay, that was our sort of basic overview of the settings. As I mentioned, there's a ton more here that we didn't get through that you can look at within the user and project settings, but hopefully that gives you enough to get going on sort of setting up your user profile the way you like and where you'll find kind of some of the most commonly needed or used settings. So thanks for listening and good luck.